All right, everyone. The chosen messiah of the left, Macron, for defeating Le Pen and casting himself as a centrist, is now no longer so beloved by the progressives and social justice warriors anymore because he dared to do the unthinkable, which is he criticized the general policies of the governments of the continent of Africa. They've decided to retaliate by declaring him a xenophobe, bigoted racist, saying, oh, he looks at Africa as a dark continent. No, he's looking at reality. The reality is this: a lot of African nations, not all of them, but a lot of them, are largely reliant upon foreign aid for infrastructure, food deliveries from the US especially, to survive. That is, that their stability is only really guaranteed by investment from the more developed world. Now, this isn't just the case in Africa. There are Latin American states, they've become destabilized at times. They get foreign aid. Parts of Southeast Asia certainly rely on the same thing. I think it's like, is it Laos or Cambodia, where they actually, they give them these little like iron fish because so many people had iron deficiencies. They tell them, oh, cook your food with one of these and it'll give you a bit of an iron supplement and your kids will be like not anemic and shit like that. You have these severely impoverished conditions. You have famines in Africa. You have plagues of locusts and all these other things that are largely suppressed in the more developed world by our technology, the way that we do business. Down there, it's not quite that way. You still have a lot of like rural tenant farmers and things like that. So these economies aren't fully stable. What Macron is worried about is he's saying, well, if there continues to have like an 8 or 9 child birth rate for every woman in Africa, on average in many of these countries, isn't that going to become too expensive for the West to guarantee their infrastructure and development over time? Isn't that going to become a problem? And so they've declared him a racist. It has nothing to do with race. If you take a population of any other group of people from the third world, put them in the same circumstances, you probably have the same problem. The problem is there's little development actually to be had there. And here's the secret. And this is something that anthropologists talk about constantly. It's actually a good debate within academia, too. We're talking mainstream academics, which surprises some people. Here's the secret. The secret is that the Western world, by aiding these forms of development, simultaneously guarantees their continued survival, while at the same time suppressing their own advancement. That as a nation becomes reliant, they have a famine, and the nation becomes reliant upon like food aid from the US. Their local farmers can't compete with free, and so they go out of business, and then you get more instability, and then they end up reliant completely upon the US or parts of Western Europe, or increasingly in some cases Chinese or something like that. And it's become a problem. It's not so much the dark continent as it is a lot of these nations simply have little to no human development. And that's the truth. It's not even a remark upon race. You're simply saying that the people of Africa, the nations there, there were some stable like North African regimes, but Libya now is no longer counted among that number. Libya's now deep third world, probably worse off than like Chad or Sierra Leone or something. Now you saw the economies of 3 different nations got totally crushed by the Ebola epidemic years ago. These were nations: Sierra Leone, Guinea, and was it the Ivory Coast? No, it was Liberia. These 3 economies got basically plowed under. They still haven't fully recovered. And this was just one epidemic outbreak. It only killed a few tens of thousands of people, but it brought all 3 of these economies to a near grinding halt. In the case of Sierra Leone, it hasn't remotely recovered, and this comes, I think a few decades ago they had a civil war too. You have nations like Rwanda, they've had similar problems. You have nations like Ethiopia, they have a famine once in a while, they need food aid and stuff like this. Remarking upon this and saying the problem is exacerbated by Western influence in one way, because of food aid especially, and also by government incompetence in many cases, because you've got some tin horn regime that's allowed to continue existing simply because they give cheap shit to the West. Saying that this is a problem has nothing to do with race. It has to do with the dynamics of African politics as they tend to be. Because in some of these cultures, not all, again, but some of these cultures, you have a mentality that it's still a big man mentality. And it's not just Africa. Again, you can get this anywhere in the world where that sort of cultural uprising happens. It just happens to be less prevalent in the developed world because people here, they have more of a meritocratic, in fact, at this point, technocratic existence, I think. In Africa, in some of these countries, though, simply somebody seizes control because they have more guns. They say, oh yeah, I'll let my soldiers have higher pay. And so they get some military behind them, and they conduct guerrilla warfare, and soon the government is overthrown. This has happened over and over. You get a nation like Somalia where the functioning government is less powerful than some militant group. Or Sudan with the Janjaweed rebels. In South Africa, you've got a looming potential genocide there, where the acting government, which is accepted by all Western nations, is saying, yeah, we might just start confiscating white people's land without compensating them. We're going to go full commie now. We're going to confiscate all these farmlands and give it to people. And they're going to make the same mistake as Mugabe, who did the same fucking thing. We're going to give it to other people who are black because, you know, fuck these, the white settlers here, the colonial scum. And they won't know how to farm necessarily because they're going to give it to the cronies, the insiders of the same political movement, just like Mugabe did, and they're going to end up with a famine. And one of the relatively decent economies of Africa, which is South Africa, it will collapse if that plan goes forward. So there's the problem with Africa. People always talk about, oh, xenophobic Europe, xenophobic United States, evil imperialists, evil, horrible way of life. I don't see so many problems around here. I don't see famines regularly breaking out in this continent. No, instead, I see our government sending enormous amounts of food to the African continent to try to keep these cultures from collapsing every time there's a food shortage. Unfortunately, it exacerbates the problem. And Macron correctly identifies, why aren't we just building infrastructure so that their local economies can stabilize? That's what you need to do. He's not being a bigot. He's trying to fucking help people. But they've declared him a racist. Oh, he's no progressive on Africa. He sees it as a dark continent. No, it's not. It's a continent that's dark because nobody bothered to invest in infrastructure. Instead, they just give them handouts and keep them poor. And that's an academic argument that's had on a regular basis. I remember discussing this with numerous professors when I was studying anthropology at UVM. Groovy UV. Supposedly like one of the most far-left universities. And they're like, yeah, all this food aid we give them, it's not helping them. It's making the problem fucking worse. And then because of our own inept immigration policies within the West, the handful of people that get a good education, they move to the US. They go to China. They go to Germany or the UK. And those countries never develop because they don't even have any intellectual force. That's the problem. We should be helping them to develop. If they're going to have this skyrocketing population, trust me when I say this, you do not want a continent of Africa with 4 or 5 times the current population that doesn't even have its own medical infrastructure. You thought the Ebola scare that we had a few years ago was bad? You wait for what's coming. It'll obliterate 1 billion people. It'll certainly spread beyond Africa. You're going to have people getting sick all over the world because of world travel and trade being as it is. But nobody wants to talk about this. They're too scared of being labeled a xenophobe for identifying that there could possibly be problems in the African continent. They will get tarred and feathered as a racist. You're a Nazi. You're a bigot. No, it's called you want these people to live a stable, decent life. You can't have that as long as you just keep giving free food to people every time there's a famine. Their local farmers will get fucked. Even leftists are willing occasionally to admit this, and yet you still have these weirdos that don't understand the concept. They think they're the same people who think, oh, free college, what a wonderful thing. There's no such thing as free. When you give free grains, free staple crops to some famine-addled African nation, all the farmers that are still functioning that could otherwise provide food get screwed. It would be better to give them the means to stabilize their own agriculture so they don't need food aid anymore. Yeah, desertification and over-mechanized farming and a lack of essential supplies and so forth. That's what's responsible for these famines. Or some plague of locusts because they don't have their own force to deal with the problem. We won't even allow them to have... It's like these African nations have been begging us for years for DDT. We look over here at environmental impact studies that are possibly dubious. There is some question at least about them. And say, oh, but the DDT killed a bunch of bald eagles. And so we can't give DDT to these countries that are racked with malaria, where millions and millions of people are keeling over prematurely because we're not willing to give them a chemical that they could use to basically eradicate the Anopheles mosquito in a lot of these areas where malaria is so prevalent. But fuck them, we'll give them free food, and they're still dying from epidemic, and we're not interested in helping them establish a medical infrastructure. We'll just send Doctors Without Borders in every time there's an Ebola or a Marburg epidemic, and we'll call it a day. That's not how you're gonna destroy the whole world by continuing to destabilize this continent through your own practices. Macron, who's essentially a globalist, correctly identifies that this is an issue, and everybody wants to breathe down his neck. But you just got done saying a week ago that he was the most manly world leader, that he was cute. He was like the Justin Trudeau of France, and a wonderful, suave, charismatic individual. But then he says, well, I'm too smart to talk to the media because you people are full of shit. And by the way, there are actually problems in the third world. Everybody wants to call him a bigot. Okay. Macron's not a bigot. He actually cares. He cares enough not to want to see a billion people die because the population density of Africa quadruples in size while no medical infrastructure is created. And the idea, people were saying in this article, they're like, oh, but he's conflating all African nations with just one general sort of stereotypical ethos and not realizing they have their own individual situations. Okay, let me elaborate upon Macron's point. Yes, indeed, there are African nations that are more stable than others. Some of them are Western-style democracies. Some of them are basically big stick rule or guerrilla warfare, like military group rule and stuff like that. There are nations in Africa that are Christian. There are nations in Africa that are Islamic. Yeah, it's certainly, there's diversity in the continent. The problem is most of these nations fit the same mold of deep third world. And that's where your population is really, really exploding. And as that continues, it's going to endanger all these other countries in Africa that do, like Nigeria or Ghana, that do have more development. And then you have like now that Libya's gone, the most developed nation in the continent is South Africa. Think about that for a moment and ask yourself if that doesn't scare you a bit. I think it scares me a little bit, the idea of a massive population explosion in a nation that is on the verge of committing another African genocide against a post-colonial white population there that will get abandoned, by the way, by the Europeans the second it starts happening. The fact that that is probably the most stable nation in Africa at this point is a little scary. Or a nation that just got racked a few years ago by the Muslim Brotherhood. I guess Egypt would be the other one. Those are the two most stable nations in Africa. Nigeria is like number 3, and they get constant Boko Haram problems. And people don't even want to talk about that. Not all Muslims or something. Yes, like we can't fight those that have actually taken up arms or actually trying to enslave people. The Nigerian government has no problem with that. Why would you call someone a bigot or an Islamophobe by thinking that that's a problem? These people are screwy. Macron is correct. And I'm not even a fan of him. I think Le Pen would have been better. But the thing is, Le Pen would have been more isolationist. She would have just said, oh, there's no problem over there. We just tend to ourselves and figure out, our French situation. Macron, because he's more interventionist, he actually aims that at the African continent, and he gets labeled a bigot instead. So now, like the centrist movement in France, apparently, it's like Le Pen, who has some leftist economic positions, by the way, she was considered Nazi mode. Now Macron, according to some of these people, is also Nazi mode. So now the centrist party in France is Nazi. So what does that leave? I guess you have to go full communist, otherwise you're an evil Nazi at this point, according to people within France. It's just nuts. It's screwy. Macron actually says something sane, identifies that there's a fucking problem in another continent. Everyone wants to jump down his throat. Doesn't make any sense to me. That's about all. Peace out.